pleasures in life is to be able to talk about people that you care a lot about. And when I was I need the all right. Here's where I want to start. In talking to various friends and colleagues about how one might frame this introduction of the speech, several spontaneously suggested that, I'll quote, "You gotta emphasize red." But I quickly rejected this advice, since I felt that really doing that would obviously be sort of crass, common, and tasteless. And at least one good friend of Nancy said that she really hates that. So I almost resisted, almost. Instead, by way of introduction, I want to take us on a brief but whirlwind journey of a little girl who, even at a very young age, sought to taste and experience everything in life to the fullest, and has continued to seek everything that life had to offer to this very day, often leaving family, friends, and colleagues gasping with aspiration in her wake. The journey begins in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Long before the Iowa caucuses, in fact, long before several of the Iowa caucuses, where Nancy had driven on a trip with her parents. On the way home, they realized that young Nancy was crying in the back seat of the car. When they asked her why she was crying, she responded, "I didn't get to see the rabbits." As you'll note, if you note from the slide, this is part of the folklore of that area. Since then, there have been few other occasions in her life where Nancy did not get to see, feel, and hold the rabbits. And her experiences and contributions have multiplied exponentially, like, well, proverbial rabbits. It should come as no surprise that Nancy was always an organizer and leader in her early days. So that, for example, her mom would suddenly find herself volunteered through Nancy's instigation in heading up the Girl Scout cookie drive or handling the snack bar at the high school football games as part of Nancy's participation in the marching band. In high school, Wauwatosa West High School in Wisconsin, she was also, to surprise no one, a member of the National Honor Society, Girls State, treasurer of the Student Council her senior year. And during high school, she gave a speech at a local VFW chapter that was so well received that it got her a great job, a summertime job, and as a playground instructor, and also helped her line up Representative Harry Roos to travel from DC to her high school to observance of Earth Day. Nancy also ran track and field and swam competitively and was the first female sports editor of the school newspaper called West Winds her junior year, and then became editor-in-chief during her senior year. Among her other jobs throughout high school, she umpired boys' Little League baseball games, and for those of us who know her well, I'm sure it was done very decisively. In the 1974 Olympian, which was the yearbook for the high school, a friend of hers since the very second grade, no, the friend was not her dog Duchess, also shown in this picture, penned some prescient words. "It's been such a joy just to know of your vibrant presence at West, see your smiling face every day in the halls, and work with you in various student activities. I don't know a person more enthusiastic for life. You just amaze me sometimes with your audacity to accomplish the fantastic." And this was well before Barack Obama stole this from Nancy's yearbook. Nancy's career as most of you know, represents virtually an entire spectrum of the AAPOR membership categories: academic, government, for-profit, and consulting as a legal expert. A unique combination of experience, involvement, and contributions in our profession. Note in the upper right-hand corner, one of the federal agencies where she served twice, initially NCHSR, kept changing its name as Nancy came and went. Although there's no evidence that there's a cause-effect relationship with this. Then again, she did pick up a husband there, and possibly in rebellion against their ongoing identity crisis of the agency, chose not to change her name. There's general consensus that the words that describe her best are task-oriented, driven, well-organized, determined, and energetic. She likes to get things organized, tidy up, and done, to make responsibilities clear, then drive for clarity and closure, deciding who does what, then just go do it. Be thankful that I resisted adding the Nike symbol to this slideshow. She is dedicated and passionate about whatever she does, but also flexible enough to let in and encourage new ideas. She can also be somewhat intimidating or lack patience in her drive to seek and encourage others to pursue their dreams, purpose, and goals. For example, her gigantic energy level, lack of patience and passion for everything she does is evident even in her love of sports, including especially golf. She is a serious golfer. And also her undying support for those Badgers. There's that red again, although I did try to get some blue into the slide. Yet another example, as a first-year graduate student, Nancy joined the team working with Charlie Cannell, including some relative unknowns named Bob Groves and Peter Miller, on this NCHS research team. As you might guess, she was not the typical graduate student. Her penchant for leadership and organization carried over to this role as well, where she eschewed a shy and retiring role and immediately stepped in to organize team activities, issuing various directives or fatwas, and progressively intimidating Peter, then Bob, and even Charlie with her authoritative and even somewhat authoritarian presence. But with ne'er-do-wells like Bob and Peter, perhaps this was not such a bad idea. Nevertheless, at that time, she also tended to wear black every day. Black turtleneck and black pants, such as that, leading Peter to affectionately dub her the Ayatollah. As those of you know her well are aware, she has largely abandoned black attire, although today she didn't get the memo, in favor of loud, flowered prints. There are another set of words that describe her very well as well. She also brings a strong, compassionate, and emotional element to everything she does. She is emotional, caring, responsible, and extraordinarily generous for her family, friends, and colleagues and students, and often their associates and families as well. These qualities have been demonstrated throughout her life in many ways and make her the unique professional friend and colleague that she is today. The first cohorts of women students at JPSM the first cohorts of students at JPSM were overwhelmingly women for whom she was always available, approachable, supportive, and caring. And she continues to be very dedicated to helping young scholars, especially young women, for whom there are still significant challenges even today. But she has also repeatedly demonstrated these qualities with friends and colleagues, such as her long-term devotion to Charlie Cannell and many others, including her leadership of the Charlie Cannell Fund and survey methodology. And she puts as much energy, love, and devotion into her family as she does into all of her professional life, or into her professional life, including her devotion to her parents, the 4 children that her husband brought into the marriage, including Justin and Bevan, who she adopted at ages 6 and 8, and her grandchildren. I particularly liked the grandchild's, I couldn't resist putting it in. And make no mistake about it, AAPOR and you, all of you, have always been a very high priority for her as well. Her passion and love for AAPOR is not just intellectual or professional, but rather, once again, reflects a deep level of caring. She throws her all into everything. She does, and she does with and for us, and we are all better for it. Those who have served on the Executive Council during the past year have all been special beneficiaries of her commitment. Her compassion and recognition of our efforts and attention, even to the little details, such as holding most of our council meetings in Washington, D.C., where 6 of our council members reside. On the other hand, as Stanley Presser recently reminded me, Nancy has been away from D.C. metro area for many years, yet her hairdresser of choice is still in D.C. Eleanor Singer opined to me that this was not particularly unusual. In fact, she herself also, until recently, has had her hairdresser in New York, and she's been in Ann Arbor for many years. But Nancy, being the rational and analytic person that she is, undoubtedly had a far better reason, given the very real risks in Wisconsin of frequenting the wrong hairdresser. In summary, it's been a long and exciting and rewarding journey from Cedar Rapids to New Orleans. And Nancy has seen, herded, and organized plenty of rabbits along the way. It is my very great honor to present to you the 61st President of the American Association for Public Opinion Research.
Well, thank you, Dick, for that, shall I say, kind introduction. Now I understand why my husband didn't come with me, because he must have coughed up a few photos. First of all, let me start by saying that it has been an absolute honor and a privilege to serve as president of AAPOR for these past 12 months. This year has left me indebted to the efforts of many others. The elected members of the Executive Council, the volunteers who serve both the national and the local chapters. Their willingness to volunteer, whether to help write position papers, review press releases, to provide wise and sage counsel. Their generosity and their hard work have served us all well during this very eventful year. And an eventful year it has been. The presidential election year, or in the case of the 2008 presidential election years, and the corresponding volume of polling activity and the coverage of those polls is a time during which a bright light shines on our profession. And so, with a nod to Charles Dickens, let me offer a simple summary of the year that has been. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Today, I think, is a good time to examine our performance during this past year and ask ourselves, how have we done? How have we rated with our constituencies, the news media, policymakers, the public at large? And I would tell you, without further ado, that there are two things, two imperatives, that strike me as essential if we are to enhance the usefulness and the credibility of our work going forward. Those imperatives are first, humility, and second, education. I will speak further about education in a few minutes, but you might ask why I mention humility. I'm not speaking about humility the way Ted Turner thinks about it. He is quoted as saying, "If only I had a little humility, I'd be perfect." In public opinion research, our humility is already there and is inherent in the fact that we're dealing with humans. And thus our science will always be inexact. We, and here I mean the collective we, survey researchers, journalists, the media, and the public, need to remember that the respondents to our surveys and polls are not static objects. The dynamic 2008 presidential primary season has served to remind us of the fragility of our profession, especially when the focus of our work is predictive polling. Not only does the dynamic nature of the humans we measure complicate our estimates, we know that our methods are, by their very nature, subject to error. We would be well served to remember the words of Albert Einstein when conducting our election polls. "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong." With that in mind, let's look at the year that has been. On January 8th of this year, Senator Hillary Clinton won the New Hampshire Democratic primary, yet all the pre-election polls had forecast a win for Senator Obama. Post-primary newspapers were splashed with headlines like "New Hampshire's polling fiasco," "Why the polls are so wrong." And in a not untypical commentary the next day, Keith Olbermann was using terms like "shoddy methodology" and "wildly wrong." He raised the question, and I quote, "Is the poll disaster as monumental as it seems?" Disaster? Monumental? I think some historical perspective to New Hampshire is useful. I certainly do not need to remind this audience of the lessons learned from the 1948 pre-election presidential polls. The response to the erroneous election forecast of 1948, specifically the report of the Committee on Analysis of Pre-Election Polls and Forecasts, called for increased research in the area of sampling, interviewing, and the basic sciences, in particular social psychology. The words of that 1948 committee and the necessary tone of humility still hold true. Even if perfect sampling of individuals is employed, said the report, we now know too little about voting intentions, factors affecting change in opinion, prestige effects, and similar topics to predict who will translate his opinion into actual voting. Certainly there did seem reason for humility among professional pollsters in the days after New Hampshire. But the need for humility reaches far beyond our own field. Let's begin by looking at a few examples of the coverage of polls immediately prior to the January 8th primary. First, there was David Broder's piece in the Washington Post just 2 days before the primary. In his concluding line, based on the recent estimates from the polls, Broder wrote that, quote, "Any way you view it, the race is now Obama's to lose." Second, there's the coverage of the McClatchy-Mason-Dixon poll. Nope, that's not. There they are. The McClatchy results were released on Sunday, January 6th, 2 days before the primary, and it was the main focus of Meet the Press that morning. Now, I know some of you in the back can't see the bottom line, but I want you to take special note of the plus or minus 5% margin of error at the bottom of the slide. The discussion on Meet the Press focused on Senator Obama's lead in the poll. Indeed, one of Tim Russert's guests concludes, after looking at these slides. And here, once again, I quote. I need my next slide. There we go. Looking at this slide, Tim Russert's guest quoted, "Obama is going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party." The statement completely ignores the fact that the estimates we see on this slide fall within the margin of error. But in addition to margin of error issues, one fact never surfaced. The results from another poll question, so the same poll, just another question, and that was this. At this point, would you say you will probably stick with that choice or that you might still change your mind? As you can see on this slide, more than a quarter of the poll respondents who favored either Clinton or Obama reported that they still might change their minds. Similarly, there was a CBS News poll released the day before the primary. Let's take a look at it.
In this frenetic campaign season,
we want the slide. You can see there are two major bullet points in the top half of the first page of the press release. The top bullet indicates that 26% of the prospective voters had changed their mind between November and January. Now let's zero in on the second bullet item. It emphasized the continuing fluidity of the decision process, with 28% of the Democratic voters saying that their minds could still change. Yet coverage of the CBS News poll rarely addressed that important detail. Typical of the coverage was this headline: "A reasonable postmortem, then, is this: the polls did, in fact, indicate a highly fluid race in the days immediately prior to the voting. The warning flags were there, that an Obama victory in New Hampshire was not a given, but few media outlets emphasized or even mentioned this profound uncertainty presented by the polls. Several members of the media commented on this very point post hoc." Let's take a listen to Katie Couric's notebook.
in this frenetic campaign season, if it's Tuesday, it's an election day somewhere, and tonight Michigan voters pick their favorite Republican running for president. To borrow a buzzword from the campaign, change is being promised not just by the candidates, but by the thousands of so-called political experts who fill TV and radio airwaves. Humbled by Hillary Clinton's surprise victory in New Hampshire, the commentator class seems suddenly more skeptical of polls and a little less certain about telling voters what they think will happen. For a long time, pollsters have warned that surveys are an inexact science, and media critics have warned that those of us without crystal balls are smart to avoid predicting the future. But until last week, those warnings were largely ignored, as was the implicit understanding that journalists are not supposed to play favorites. Hopefully, this renewed objectivity is a change that's here to stay. That's a page from my notebook. I'm Katie Couric, CBS News.
The point I hope to make here is not one of criticism of either journalists or pollsters. Instead, I want to point to the importance of communication between journalists and survey researchers. There is a constant tension between those of us who produce survey results and those of us in the media. If survey organizations present their results accurately and cautiously, their press releases may appear dull, lacking in news value. If the press releases describing poll and survey findings are couched in dramatic terms, they may capture more attention, but may also run the risk of undermining the very scientific tenet on which we base our work. What then is AAPOR's role in this relationship between the media and survey researchers? Some of you may remember Mike Trogut's presidential address at the AAPOR conference in May of 2000. In it, he said, "The key to providing more and better information to citizens is to improve the analysis and interpretation of reporting about public opinion by increasing our interactions with journalists." Mike added, and here was his key point, that AAPOR needs to establish and maintain improved relations with journalists so that we can, and here I'm quoting again, help at the point at which they are preparing stories rather than critiquing their performance. So how have we been doing? And what more could we do? AAPOR members have in fact been providing education in a variety of venues to journalists. Our membership includes journalists, and many of our members are involved in the training of journalists through a variety of venues: short courses, seminars, university-based courses, to name but a few. These efforts have not only provided help to journalists trying to sort out complicated survey data under pressures of deadlines, they've also helped to serve to identify AAPOR and its membership as a resource for those wrestling with understanding the methods we employ. Another example is the way AAPOR has teamed with the Poynter Institute over the past year to develop a course for Poynter's online journalist training project. This step toward fulfilling Mike Trogut's vision was accomplished through the extraordinary efforts and organizational talents of Molly Ann Brody, chair of the Education Committee. Titled Understanding and Interpreting Polls, this is a 4-part course, free to the public, that helps journalists better understand how polls are conducted, what questions to ask about a study's methodology, and what the margin of error really tells us about an estimate. If you have not visited the site or taken the course, I encourage you to do so. In addition to Molly Ann, there are many others to whom we owe thanks for these efforts. Molly Ann has had excellent support from her assistant, Allison Kopicki, as well as other members of the Journalist Education Committee, Rich Morin, Cliff Zukin, and not surprisingly, Mike Trogut. The content of the NewsU course is the fruit of their labors. They, in turn, have had the benefit of timely and detailed reviews by several AAPOR members, most notably Mick Cooper, Rob Daves, Scott Keeter, and Stanley Presser. Their efforts on behalf of AAPOR and the profession as a whole have been Herculean. Please join me in thanking all of them for their time and hard work this past year. These endeavors are a great start, but there is more we can do and should do. We need to continue to develop ways to be more effective in addressing the questions posed to us by journalists and the public. Many of these questions focus on issues of methodology, very nettlesome questions for which we rarely have simple, eloquent answers. For example, how accurate or reliable are data from internet panels? We know that criticisms of estimates based on self-selected samples abound. Counter-arguments are made that probability samples with low response rates are no better. Another thorny issue, are data collected via interactive voice recognition systems as good as those collected using live interviewers? Such questions are best addressed through the scientific endeavors of our members. AAPOR can, however, and should serve as a gateway between survey researchers and the general public with regard to methodological factors that impact the quality of survey estimates. In at least one area, we have served this role for years. AAPOR's standard definitions are the reference manual and model for response rate and cooperation rate calculations used throughout the profession. Other resources that AAPOR provides, for example, our statement on push-pulls or our code of ethics with respect to minimum disclosure, illustrate the role that AAPOR can serve both to and for journalists and the public. So where do we need to go from here? These volunteer efforts have gotten us to the place we are today with respect to the education of journalists and the public about our craft, our profession. These efforts are part of what made 2008 the best of times for me serving as AAPOR's president. But we cannot, as an organization, continue to rely on the altruistic and generous nature of our members in their service to the organization. If we are to continue to serve as a voice to and a resource for journalists, we are at a juncture where we now must financially support these efforts. We would be remiss, I think, to not take advantage of the inroads that have been made this year. So let me close by outlining some proposals for your consideration. First, that AAPOR formally adopt the Journalist Education Subcommittee as a standing subcommittee. The sole focus of this subcommittee would be broadly defined as journalist education. As I have already indicated, Mike Trogut suggested something akin to this in 2000, and Molly Ann Brody has planted the seeds for such a subcommittee to become an ongoing effort of the association. Second, unlike many of our other AAPOR committees, I would propose that we provide financial and staff support for these activities. During precarious economic times such as this, it may seem brash to suggest increased spending. But I do believe that with a concerted effort, we can and should channel some of our revenue into such efforts. We simply cannot continue to be a voice and resource for the journalism community via voluntary efforts alone. Third, we need to begin a more intensive dialogue with journalism programs at universities to offer assistance in the training of the next generation of journalists with respect to survey methodology. I realize that journalists have a broad array of topics for which they must be well-versed. I'm not suggesting that opinion polls are more important than understanding meta-analysis or clinical trials. But much of the data that form the foundation of media stories, whether coverage of politics, issues related to the nation's leading economic indicators, or concerns about the health and well-being of individuals in our society are based on survey data. A sound understanding of the nuances of our methods is essential if the next generation of journalists is to accurately cover those issues. Finally, I would encourage AAPOR to establish ongoing relationships with foundations to further our efforts in these areas. Foundations offer us the opportunity to draw upon a range of resources for the mutual benefit of our respective missions. The partnership with the Poynter Institute, funded by the Knight Foundation, stands as an excellent example. This will not be an easy path to follow. It may require us to consider tightening our belt in some areas and to attempt fundraising to support our efforts. But I firmly believe that such efforts, coupled with a sprinkling of humility about our craft and our science, will position us well in the years to come and allow us to build on our strengths and to more effectively improve journalists and the public's understanding of survey and polling results. Thank you.